collected. We know some things about Starship. We don't know everything about Starship. While that makes it difficult to analyze, and you've got to fill in a lot of the gaps, at the same time, it makes it difficult to analyze. So anybody that says that they've solved the problem, you don't know that because you don't have enough data to do the analysis. We haven't been given that data to be able to do that analysis. We do have intelligence guided by experience, and so we can make some guesses at what fills in those gaps. We know that LOX methane has a certain specific impulse. We know that to do a Mars mission with a Starship, you need lots of refuelings at Earth. You need lots of refuelings at Mars, which you have to send in advance. You either need to send that propellant in advance or send a bunch of material and hardware to the surface to be set up and robotically make your propellant in situ while you're there. You can start to see that this starts to become kind of a Rube Goldberg way to do Mars. Will I say it can't work? No. But will I say that it's really, really difficult and challenging, and there are a lot of miracles to make it work? Absolutely. And so the notion that SpaceX has solved Mars or is going to do Mars with Starship, I would challenge that on its face. I don't think the analysis and the data bear that out. So switching gears, let's talk about the nuclear aspect for a minute. You at the very top you said, why haven't we done nuclear yet if it's so good for Mars? Well, we haven't sent people to Mars. I mean, that's really the end goal. I mean, we haven't done it, so we haven't done it. It seems very simple, really. The thing with nuclear, there are challenges to making it work too. However, all my challenges get solved here at Earth and in low Earth orbit before I leave. Nuclear is nice. It has a higher specific impulse, especially when I talk about nuclear thermal propulsion. It is high thrust, which means it will get our astronauts there and back quickly, but I can carry all the fuel I need to get back with me. So I don't need to do any complicated refueling at Mars. I can return without having to make propellant or do any kind of send a pre-positioned propellant to get back. So all the miracles, all the hard things I need to do are confined to Earth and then low Earth orbit. That's a much easier problem to deal with than having to pre-position a whole lot of things and count on a whole bunch of things done remotely out of Earth orbit after my astronauts have left in certain cases. From a reliability standpoint alone, that's kind of a big deal. And so if it were me, since I am the chief engineer for nuclear propulsion, I guess I'm a little bit biased. But at the same time, there's a reason why I've gone this route. It's not that I, am in favor of nuclear propulsion because I'm chief engineer. I am in favor of nuclear propulsion because technically it makes sense.
Agree. I have some follow-ups, as might some of those folks, but let's move to Rian. Rian, you are at the Department of Energy. DOE has long been a backbone of U.S. space nuclear efforts, especially in light of the new executive orders. And actually, I will return to Amy for that in a little bit. How should DOE's role evolve in this next phase as we shift from design to the next step? As Kurt just said, maybe this time we are going to do it because we're going to do it, right? So.
No, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. At the Department of Energy, I'm in the Office of Nuclear Energy, and we feel like we're having a moment. It's really exciting. I don't think in the past 20 years I've seen any executive orders that are promoting nuclear technology, and we have 4 on May 23rd. And they do a lot, and they say a lot, and so they set the policy of the United States. And it includes, by the way, advancing nuclear technology for national security, by the way, which space is a subset of that. And it directs the Department of Defense to get serious about nuclear technology. It directs us to work with them very closely. If you actually look at how it talks about DOE and its role in advancing nuclear technology for defense, it talks about things that we already do with the Department of Defense, which is looking at technology maturity, helping secure fuel, helping provide infrastructure, helping really just advise on the technical pieces. The executive orders also really push towards more reform, and Amy is really the expert as it relates to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But I'll say the Department of Energy, it pushes us to explore the expanded use of DOE authorization for nuclear systems. Which I tell people, a lot of people that don't follow this space kind of don't understand, and I quote that Ted Lasso quote, which is, be curious. Be curious about this expanded DOE authorization, because we already do this. This is kind of already in our playbook. We demonstrate reactors for terrestrial use, actually even for transportable use at our national laboratories every single day. And so part of the executive order drives us to do more of that. There's a lot of interesting things in there. I encourage you to all read them. But I'll just note that it's really exciting because I steward the programs that do research, development, demonstration, and deployment, primarily terrestrial and nuclear technology. But the idea is to make nuclear energy available for everybody who wants it, and specifically fission power. That high energy density source that the Navy, realized was really, really useful if you want to build a submarine and want to, operate at sea for long periods, is the same high energy density source that the Department of Defense thinks would provide resilient power. It's the same high energy density source that can provide resilient power not just for terrestrial missions, but also for space, right? It really is about being high energy density. And what that provides you from a space perspective is if I want to go far, if I want to be able to turn around, if I want to bring fuel with me, it all makes sense. It's just that high energy density source. And at least in my office, I'll note, we have been really, really active over the past couple of years, and we're going to be supercharged now to demonstrate and deploy advanced technologies, including microreactors that lend themselves, at least in terms of the overlap from a technical maturity and technical work to the work that is needed to advance space fission power. So we're really excited to leverage these programs. I'll say, over 15 years ago, when the Department of Energy was asked to look at space nuclear power, they went to naval reactors because the Office of Nuclear Energy didn't have this breadth of test beds and programs related to microreactors. But today we're in a different place, and so I'm really, really excited. In my office, we're in the Office of Advanced Reactors, which is a subset of the Office of Reactors that I steward. We're developing a newly formed space reactor program. It's small, but the idea is to work with NASA, Department of Defense, and industry to enable the utility of nuclear technology for space exploration. So to answer your question, I think our role, really is to take advantage of the things that we already do for terrestrial applications. It is looking at maturing the technology. It is looking at providing infrastructure. It is looking at ensuring that the fuel is readily available, with the end goal of providing this high energy density source for an application that many of us and everybody here is very excited about.
Very cool. The quote I remember from Ted Lasso is "believe." That's a good one too, but I like "be curious." So Fred, turning over to you. Kurt talked about the case for nuclear propulsion for Mars. I want you to make the case for nuclear propulsion for national security applications. Even though this is a conference on Mars, I think the core technology is the same. And we want to be able to see how we can leverage not just DoD expertise, but also potentially not just DOE expertise, but also DoD expertise.
I think that's fair. So I'm the CEO of a startup called Dark Fission Space Systems. I love to hear DOE saying that they're jumping all over this because we could certainly use some help out here as the little guy. We do see a very strong case for a national security application for these kinds of systems. And honestly, no offense to the Martians out there, but I think that case will be put in place before we necessarily graduate to transportation out to celestial objects. The truth of the matter is that we are seeing some very interesting challenges erupting in space. I'm sure we've all heard about what the Russians are up to with interesting gear they're putting in low Earth orbit. The truth is we don't have much insight or control over things that happen on orbit. And what Kurt said earlier is as true for cislunar, space between here and the moon, as it is for everywhere else. You want to get places fast, you want to get places efficiently, nuclear is going to get you there, and at some point the Space Force is going to stand up and really figure that out. Turns out they're actually funding us to go work this problem right now. But I think there's going to be a growing consensus over how we're going to have to approach the problem of meeting our potential adversaries up on orbit. And again, I think we're going to see that before we end up on Mars. I also think we're going to see commercial cases for using this capability in cislunar space. before we end up on Mars. And so our company is very interested in going out and getting both commercial customers as well as defense and civil customers to go solve this problem. But yeah, I'm absolutely convinced, no surprise, I'm running a company that does it, but I'm absolutely convinced that we are going to have to graduate to nuclear for exactly what Rian said. We need the power density, we need the energy density, and you're not going to get that from the indirect fusion source that's sitting 93 million miles away. You're just not. And if you want to go to other places, if you're trying to go to the asteroid belt, if you want to go out further, the sun is even more of a problem. And you're just simply going to have to do this if our future is out and settling and exploring the solar system. If that's what we're planning to do, then we're kidding ourselves if we think we've already got all the tools at our disposal. We don't. So.
Yeah, in my previous panel, I talked about one M&M-sized U-235 has as much energy as a metric ton of coal. So somebody fact-check me, but that's, there's some serious, serious energy density.
Few M&Ms.
Few M&Ms, okay, few M&Ms. Okay, so turning to Amy. So obviously, we are, we have plans for Mars, we have plans for national security. From a regulatory and a policy perspective, what is holding us back? What are the top legal and regulatory obstacles for us to have? Forget a mission to Mars or even to cislunar space, just doing a basic demonstration of nuclear propulsion.
So I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to start by answering your first question, which is if nuclear is so good and so important, why aren't we doing it now?
I love it.
Okay, and then tie it into what the regulatory issues are, because it turns out they go hand in hand. So I've been in the nuclear space for 20 years. I think I worked with my first advanced reactor client in 2006. They have gone bankrupt because they couldn't find a customer, right? They couldn't find somebody that actually wanted to deploy their reactor. We were at a very different time then. In nuclear in particular, we were looking at a whole bunch of new nuclear power plants, right? And then the price of natural gas tanked. So we had Fukushima accident. Everybody canceled their new nuclear power plants. And those were not big innovations on the existing technology. They were still large light water reactor technologies. And it was really hard for companies that were developing microreactor technologies or small and modular reactor technologies to find a customer. It's still hard, by the way. However, we have reached a few tailwinds that continue to work really well for nuclear. Energy reliability, energy density, and climate change. So it's clean energy, right? And so we saw a whole bunch of people looking at deploying nuclear because they were looking at how do I reduce my carbon emissions for my carbon-free power and my process heat. We saw companies that were looking at nuclear because they needed intense amount of reliability for the power that they needed to deploy, such as in the chemical industry. Data centers are no different. They needed an intense amount of power. It needs to be reliable. It needs to be energy dense. And by the way, if the power goes out at like a data center, all the equipment melts, right? So when I did this thing the other day, I was reading about an Amazon data center in Minnesota that needed 600 megawatts of backup generators. 600 megawatts of backup generators for their data center in case the grid, shut off the power. That's an insane, business proposition. And they were also arguing they didn't need any permits for them. And I was like, well, the state disagreed. However, what happened is there's all an interconnection between nuclear innovation and there being a commercial model for it, right? So when you look at what businesses decide to fund something, you either need to go out and raise private capital, or you could be super, super rich and do it yourself, but then you eventually want to commercialize and you need to have capital who wants to invest in it. You need a customer for your product, and so you need to be driving towards a customer and towards a use case. And terrestrial nuclear power struggled to do that for a while, right? It's changed significantly, though. We see companies developing a range of microreactor technologies. You see companies developing a range of small modular reactor technologies. You see companies looking at deploying Gen 3 Plus, which are traditional light water reactor technologies, but through a spin, they're more advanced, And then there's the Gen 4 reactors, which are, use alternative fuels and coolants. And they're moving forward towards licensing. So the X-Energy application is in for the Dow chemical plant, which is like an incredible project for carbon-free power and process heat, but also reliable power and process heat for Dow chemical plant in Texas. We see the TerraPower application in before the NRC right now for the Natrium project in Wyoming. Kairos has received 2 NRC license application reviews for their test reactor for their SMR design. All these activities are enabling space nuclear because they're creating an ecosystem and an environment in the commercial sector that can dovetail in with the government sector to reach a common objective. And so I just remember talking recently to somebody in the Department of Defense about where the Department of Defense should focus their efforts when they invest in technologies. And I'm like, it's going to be in the stuff that nobody in the commercial sector is doing. If you're trying to get the biggest bang for your buck, right? Do it in the stuff where the commercial sector is already doing it, but you need a tweak for defense purposes. Or do it in the side where the private sector is not doing it, and there's not a commercial application, but you need it for defense use. So you need to spend the time and resources on making sure that happens. Don't do it in the middle where you're just doing a different version of what the private sector is already doing. Like, I think that's a waste of resources. And so the good news is right now, as an offshoot of the terrestrial applications for nuclear, we're seeing the space applications for nuclear peel off. So BWXT is working on the Draco project. Westinghouse is working on a space reactor. I assume you're working on a space reactor.
That was the plan.
Right? And then, there's a number of other companies as well, but they get the benefit of there being an appetite for this technology and an interest for this technology. So this kind of dovetails into the why haven't we done it yet? I have been a long proponent that nuclear is where we are going on a bunch of different fronts. It is clearly where we are going on the space front if we have space objectives that we're trying to meet, right? So colonization on Mars, deep space exploration, mining, all of this is going to require nuclear, and that is like an evident fact. We don't have another technology that can serve that purpose and for the duration that we need it to. Other areas where nuclear is evident is I think we're going to find more and more terrestrial applications of nuclear. I liken that some of our existing energy technologies are like whale blubber, which is, I'm from Massachusetts, so I do an overarching number of whaling references, but like whaling used to dominate our economy. One of the richest cities in the world was New Bedford, Massachusetts, right? Which is now a city that doesn't have that much money, but it was dominated by whaling. Things change, technologies change, and they come to market. So on the regulatory side, we have a regulatory framework that is set up for terrestrial applications of nuclear energy. That said, the Atomic Energy Act leaves the ability, and this is all reflected in the executive order, for the Department of Defense and Department of Energy to use their own authorizations when it serves a DOE or a DOD purpose, right? And that can be national security umbrella. One of the things that the executive order did was kind of make it clear that DOE should, in fact, use its authority, and DOD should, in fact, use its authority when it serves a national security objective, of which space exploration is clearly a subset of that, as Rian said. And so on the regulatory side, though, we're kind of left with, where do you go? And so I started getting phone calls from folks a few years ago saying, NASA wants me to build a reactor. I need to build a prototype. Who do I go to? And I'm like, well, if NASA is who's asking you to do it, is there anybody else involved? Because I'm like, tell me DOD or DOE is somehow involved in this. And they're like, no. And I was like, okay, if it's just for NASA, and by the way, NASA wants it to be a purely private activity. Okay, so now it's like, you guys have to go figure it out. You can't build a prototype under that scenario without an NRC license. Including, you can't do R&D. You have very restrictive environment for building and demonstrating your prototype without getting an NRC license, which is in fact very expensive. And not at all designed for this type of application, where you would get an NRC license to demonstrate a technology that is intended for a space application. And so you ended up with these kind of gaps about who you went to. If DOE was involved, fantastic. DOE could use its oversight authority, which is in fact what it did in the past, when the one time we deployed a space reactor.
1965.
Yeah, which is it was a while ago. But there's a path. The interesting thing about government is if somebody has done it before, everybody's like, well, we could just do this. People tell me this about offshore nuclear power plants. They're like, well, we've done it before, so like it's no big deal. And I was like, yeah, like 50 years ago, and it was never built. But that doesn't matter. People think you did it before, we could just do it again. And so those are the things. It's trying to figure out who is it for, what type of authority do you have under the existing statutes, and then how do you deploy it? So the regulatory gaps are, if you're a purely civilian activity that just involves a contract for NASA and DOE and DOD aren't involved, you're NRC. Nobody wants to be in that space. So what you need to do is try to get under the DOE or DOD space for the authorization for the reactor itself. And there's avenues for that, and I think the executive orders will further help that.
Okay, well, let me reframe my question, because let's say DOE is involved. In that scenario where NASA, DOE are working together as a team to build a reactor, and let's say it isn't even necessarily a private company, although it can be. I would like it to be.
What kind of company would it be?
It would be called Dark Fission.
No, I mean, what if it's not a private company? I'm wondering.
Well, I meant like commercial, you versus, let's say, Lockheed Martin, BWXT.
So kind of a large
traditional
that isn't a real company.
There's people from those real companies here. So I guess the question I'm asking is, in that scenario where the government is working as it's supposed to, what do you see as the top legal or regulatory obstacles, or do you think there aren't any if that's the scenario?
Literally the easiest question you could ask me is, DOE's involved, what's the pathway forward, right? And one of the things is, when you have a government panel, they always opt for the easy one, and they never give you the hard one, so they just give the hypothetical. The good news is that if it's a DOE, if DOE is involved, DOE can use its licensing, or it's not licensing, it's oversight authority for the reactor technology, just as it has in the past.
And by the way, that's our plan.
Yeah.
Right? I do not want to go out and fight to get an NRC license for a startup.
It doesn't work.
Good luck, right? So what I'd like to do is I'd like to make sure I can do everything else, and then I assemble the thing on a DOE site. And then I ship it to the Cape, and off we go. And then all I really need is FAA to say it's okay with a little interagency buy-in.
Yeah, so I guess this is where I'm also trying to go, Amy. Like, is FAA an obstacle? Are there any other obstacles that we need to be worrying about? Well, and I don't even mean to say FAA is an obstacle. FAA, I love you guys. Mwah.
Well, I will give an example. Of the interesting thing about nuclear is how many biases people bring to the discussion about the technology. And so I think I told you the story before, but I was on a panel with somebody from the FAA talking about space nuclear. And he said he had all the decision-making authority, and if he had his choice, he would never put nuclear in space because it's just not safe. And I said, what do you mean it's not? Like, I was like, what do you mean it's not safe? And he goes, you can't tell me that it's a good idea to put astronauts on a rocket with a nuclear reactor on board, because that's super dangerous. And I was like, more than the actual launch and everything that happens with that? And then I was like, have you heard of the nuclear navy? And the fact that people are on submarines right next to a nuclear propulsion system and have been for decades, right? And it has an incredibly safe and known track record. So when you ask me what are the problems in government, it's that perspective. It's the person who doesn't understand the technology, doesn't understand what it's supposed to be deployed for, and tries to throw up flags that slow down deployment and development.
Billy doesn't understand dose rates in space.
Doesn't understand a whole host of things, right? It was just a matter of where do I start with this statement?
This is the time where I can throw something in. So I have a little office out in Leesburg, Virginia. Now, you guys heard this one, okay? So I've just stood up the office. I've got some engineers in there. We're having a great time. And like any small company, we need liability insurance and workers' comp and everything else. So we did that because, you got to do it. Well, it turns out that the large insurance company based somewhere in Connecticut got wind of the fact that we're a startup trying to build a nuclear reactor for space applications. And they said, time out, no appetite for that kind of crazy stuff. We're not going to do that. Yeah. And so they canceled our policy because we have 5 engineers behind computers working in Leesburg, Virginia. Yeah. All right? There's no reactor being built in Leesburg, Virginia, right, folks? I mean, you can imagine I'm not going to do that, right? Yeah. But this is the kind of crazy that we're dealing with. Yeah. And those biases are very hard to overcome.
But it is getting better, right? I mean, it's not just the kind
that
of
wasn't good.
Yeah.
That wasn't good.
That wasn't good. Polling is getting better. And I mean, I don't know, maybe because I'm just, whenever I take the metro, everybody knows about SMRs now. It used to be like a wonky thing in 2006.
That's true.
Everybody knows about SMRs, reads about SMRs. I've had, I won't say serious, but not unserious conversations with AI hyperscalers about space nuclear to power data centers in space in the future, right? These are kind of real conversations. And so it's quite mainstream. But I wanted to just make one point about the DOE authorization. At least the perspective that we have in the department always has been, this is for first of a kind, using DOE authorization can make a lot of sense, but the NRC would be involved and they'd be looking over our shoulder. And so the idea would be ultimately to enable commercial industry and to allow NRC to provide commercial licensees. Whether this is for terrestrial or space, that's kind of the business model. So we are closely coordinated, but looking to, if we expand the use of DOE authorization, it is also with an eye towards helping the NRC become really have an easier time at being able to license advanced reactor concepts. And there's good language in the executive order that really kind of gets to kind of how that would look.
That's awesome. Back to Kurt. So Kurt, we did NERVA rover in the early 60s. We've had SP100, JIMO, Prometheus, over a dozen programs in the last 60 years. We've spent maybe $20 billion or more. The question I have is, what needs to be done differently this time? What's a step one that doesn't die and leads to step 2 and 3 and beyond? Like, what do we do differently that we don't stop this time?
So as you were speaking, actually, this came to mind, and it gets back to a less pithy answer to your question of why is it going to be different this time? From a regulatory perspective, from a business perspective, the switch to HALEU as a fuel. And so those of you that are not nuclear engineers, nuclear fuel comes in various enrichment levels, obviously very high enrichment, very high levels of U-235. The fissile type is what we make bombs with. It's what have fueled reactors in the past. Now we are moving into, and then light water reactors are 3 to 5% enrichment. HALEU is about 20% enrichment. It's high enough where you can make a compact reactor, but it's not so high that it's easily made into weapons. And so the nice thing about this is you can make those compact reactors, you make those SMRs and those micro reactors, which have a very nice business case on Earth. But it's also enough to where I can build a reactor for space. It's not quite as mass efficient in some cases, although once I get to a certain size, that kind of falls out in the wash. But there's two things I get out of that. One is we don't have to pay full freight on the development of the technology anymore, right? NERVA rover, SNAP, those were standalone programs where we were developing the technology, the government alone, right, for government use. There were no other real business cases for that, especially in the 60s and 70s. But the second is, from a licensing and a handling standpoint, there's only a few places, a few organizations that can handle very highly enriched uranium. And there are many more that can handle low enriched, HALEU, and be able to make it work. So I like to talk in these forums about accessing the intellectual firepower of the nation. Companies are not going to come to the table if there's no benefit to them long run. And if they can't handle it and if they can't work with it and they can't make a profit off of it, they're not going to do it. So the switch to HALEU, in my mind, is kind of a big game changer that makes it different this time. And so that's kind of my initial answer to the question is, the biggest first step is one we've already taken, and one that you were part of, in fact, which is the move to the HALEU fuel, which allows us to both, like I said, do space and do terrestrial. The terrestrial makes the space possible. The space makes terrestrial better. So you get a nice little feedback loop in the technology development there.
Folks, just so you know, and you may not know this, I don't know if you've mentioned it yet.
I haven't.
So back in 2016, this was the lady who basically spearheaded all of the regulatory framework changes for things like space nuclear that got into Scott Pace's work that ended up in the reason that FAA has, the kind of interesting authority that's now got to work commercial space nuclear. Yeah. This is her right here.
Slight friendly amendment. It was part of a team, and Aaron Miles at OSDP was the one with the pen. So, we're hoping that Aaron Miles will help us again to go to the next level. Okay, moving on to Rian. Rian, what internal or cross-agency reforms are needed to accelerate space reactor programs? And by cross-agency, I mean with NASA or even with DoD.
No, thank you. I think so. I think on the regulatory side of the House, we have clear direction from the president for kind of internal reform, DOE, NRC, streamlining these pieces. But it also directs us to work together. It doesn't specifically direct NASA, but I think that work that we're doing on the terrestrial side of the House, on the regulatory side of the House, will lend itself well. And so I think that's going to be work that's ongoing. As we think about a partnership with NASA, being able to delineate, I mean, I think you're right, which is or maybe you made the point about being able to do the investments that really the government is suited to do, kind of the high-risk R&D. We do the Department of Energy, or maybe Amy mentioned it. And so being able to delineate between, what should DOE really focus on, taking advantage of not just the capabilities that we have in the infrastructure and the expertise, but being able to identify kind of a clear delineated role, right, so that we are good stewards of taxpayer money. And so that's going to be kind of important, and that'll require good coordination with NASA, which I think will happen. I think the last piece is, I've spent a lot of time working with the kind of broader interagency on a lot of nuclear topics. We have a strong interagency, but it's not focused on space. Kind of the space community, in a way, at least within the U.S. government, tends to be more siloed. The nuclear community has always been pretty siloed, and so, finding ways to integrate them. They integrate well at places like OSTP, which is kind of a lean organization, but even within the Department of Defense, right, you find that the silos are very different. So I think looking for ways to, and I know everybody brings this up with most nuclear topics, whether it's international exports or space or kind of you name your topic, but having a kind of a strong interagency team that is focused on this topic is always useful.
Thank you. Yeah, no, we do need that. Fred, I want to move back to you, private company. VC funding is flooding into launch, into, communications, all sorts of space subsectors, but not nuclear as much, although obviously there's some. What needs to change for investors to take space nuclear more seriously and put real money like they're putting in other subdomains?
Success. And it's very simple. I mean, if you're a VC, the answer for the VC is, I've got limited partners sitting out there. They want to make money. They want to make money soon. They don't want to wait 15, 20 years for it. They need to see proof of principle. There is VC money. There is private investment, especially in the terrestrial side. But the space side, and I like to say this to folks, has a couple problems. One is space is already hard. It's a truism. Space is hard. Nuclear turns out to be hard for reasons we all understand. I could build this reactor in my garage if I had to. But we can't. So space nuclear is hard squared, folks. And as a result, you give this to your average associate at a VC firm, and they get scared quick. They see the moles all over your face, and they run away screaming. The fund manager may never even see it. So it is tough. That said, I do think that as we see access, getting us to low Earth orbit, giving us the ability to demonstrate more and more, working with NASA, working with DoD, showing this can be done. If private companies can partner properly, both with commercial, strategic partners as well as government partners, I think that success will build on itself. And I think this is the best chance we've had in a long time. We've got the access in place. Hats off to Elon and everybody who works for him and everybody in the community. We can get to orbit now, and we can do it very efficiently. I heard somebody say we're inefficient getting to orbit. BS. We are as efficient as we've ever been. It's only going to get better. And that is what's driving this ability to go look at systems like this. So I think it's about to get better. But if you're a VC, you're from Missouri. You want to see if a little company can pull it off first. You're not going to jump in right away. And as much as they like to claim that they are on the leading edge of this stuff, they never are, right? They're generally lemmings. They wait until commercialization is out there, and then they try to jump in and make their money. I get it. I understand it. I don't have to like it, but I do get it. So I think right now we're in this transitional period where companies like mine are going to have to rely on some government largesse as well as hopefully both commercial partnerships and honest private investment. 3 years ago, I would have told you I thought I could have done the whole thing with private investment. But 3 years have turned my hair white. So.
Can I add to that?
Go ahead,
Absolutely.
Yeah, so VC money is not patient capital.
No.
Right? They want an off-ramp and they want it within like 5 to 6 years, right? They want it quickly. So the more we deploy nuclear projects and the more they see a path to their off-ramp so that they can make their money, the more money that's going to go into it, right? They also want to know regulatory uncertainty isn't going to be a problem, delays aren't going to be a problem, cost overruns aren't going to be a problem, because no matter how tiny your reactor is, they're all still looking at Vogtle. And they're like, that's not my jam, right? So when you think about...
For those who don't know, Vogtle, it took, 12 years and 20 billion, or?
It was a super expensive nuclear power plant, and it was the last example we have of a nuclear power plant that we licensed and constructed in the United States. And it was not a good example for the world of private capital, right? So when you look at your bins of money, where you're going to get money, you can have your when you look at who's already invested in nuclear projects, they historically have been guys with billions of dollars, like a tech person who wants to invest in nuclear for a reason. Bill Gates and TerraPower, Cam Gafarian and X-Energy, somebody who had lots of money and was going to, and Kairos is the same thing. Lots of access to private capital, and it was their own capital, and they could just keep putting it in, and the project still took longer than they expected. But then they get to a point where they've de-risked it enough, and they can bring in more money. So X-Energy has a whole bunch of different investors, but including Amazon was an anchor investor for a $500 million equity investment into X-Energy. Other investors included the University of Michigan and Ken Griffin in his individual capacity, right? He's from Citadel. So that was really big deal, right? And then a couple of other nuclear companies have gone public, right? And so they're publicly traded. And with the EOs, they are very grateful for the government right now because their stock is going through the roof. And so that's where your money's coming from, right? So it's U.S. government supporting it, or you can bring in certain amounts of private capital, but where are you getting your private capital? And it's not PE investable. PE doesn't invest in things like this. As you de-risk it, and as you see other technologies emerge, you're opening the door each step of the way for the private capital. And as you see the infrastructure needed to develop around it, like, hey, there's commercial sources of HALEU. Hey, the US government said they're going to do some downblending for HALEU to make it available for nuclear reactors. Hey, these other companies are building microreactors and they plan on mass manufacturing them. And the NRC looks like they're going to get on board with that. And with the EO, maybe the NRC will get more on board with that. All these things create an ecosystem that opens up the capital to enable it to invest in these technologies.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, Kurt, you mentioned something?
I want to add, so both of you mentioned an additional point here. So we talk about capital here a lot, but both of you briefly touched on time and basically the time to basically return your investment. Bhavya, you were at NETS a few weeks ago. You saw me give a talk, and I talked about big programs, big nuclear programs, and how things like the Manhattan Project, I mean, from 3 years to nothing to building the bombs, right, and building all of the infrastructure to do that, and all of Hanford, all of Oak Ridge, all of Los Alamos. You say, well, that was the war and everything. Okay, great, but fission was only discovered in 1938. So I mean, that's not a really long timeline. I don't care how much money you throw at it. In Nerva Rover and SNAP, you had about a 10-year period in the 60s where you built 20 nuclear thermal propulsion reactors and 6 power reactors, one of which was launched, which was SNAP 10A, over that 10-year period. And they were doing like 2 or 3 NTP reactors a year in those things. So there's this notion and there's this acceptance that because it's nuclear, it has to take a long time. And I would challenge that and say that historically, there is a basis that says it doesn't have to take a long time. I made a closing comment in my talk, and I said, it's not safer just because it took longer to do. There's a corollary to that, which is it's certainly more expensive if it takes longer to do.
By the way, I don't know if that talk is public, but I highly encourage you to go listen to it. It's eye-opening, and you have many other examples there as well. Rian, you were going to say something.
Yeah, just to add to the conversation. I've been kind of watching the capital that comes into nuclear, and it's really interesting because it's a lot of non-traditional end users that are interested in nuclear technology today. It used to be in the United States utilities. And utilities tend to be very risk averse, and so we haven't built plants in a long time. But now you have, not just venture firms, but AI companies. You have the Department of Defense is a non-traditional end user for these commercial terrestrial reactors, right? And really space companies as well, right? I think there's all these end users, and what's interesting to me is that they're really excited about HALEU-based technologies, right? Okay. I think a lot of that is because a lot of the HALEU-based fuel cycles tend to offer kind of advanced passive safety measures. From a utility perspective, they're happy with a Gen 3 plus reactor that has a 72-hour margin, for being able to have human intervention. But for a Microsoft or an Amazon or a newcomer country, they like the idea of a reactor, for example, that you can say, hey, this is walk-away safe. So I say this because there's a lot of excitement about these advanced technologies from the non-traditional end users, and there's interesting funding, but the funding is going towards making these things commercially viable, right? And that's the one point that I want to make, is that at this moment in time, we're getting close, and everything certainly we're doing at DOE is to try to get to the commercial viability of not just advanced reactors, but specifically SMRs. But what we do know is that if you make reactors smaller, they will be more expensive, right? And the theory of the case for SMRs has always been, if you want it to be commercially viable, that you have to make them modular and make them in factories. And so a lot of this funding is going towards people not just optimizing the manufacturing and the design, but also with a goal towards getting factories to actually make them small. I say this because the technical viability of fission happened when Fermi stacked this pile, right? Like as soon as that happened, we made reactors and weapons right away, but we didn't make commercially viable reactors, right? The Navy's reactors are not commercially viable. And so the theory of the case is still, we're still trying to prove for these small modular reactors and microreactors, and I think we're going to get there. But it's interesting to me because we're seeing venture capital investment in fusion as well, which to me, fusion, the technical viability, I feel like they haven't had their Fermi pile moment
I would
yet.
say it's preferential. They're absolutely going to fusion, and they bypass fission entirely.
Yeah, which is interesting to me because I don't feel like they've even had their Fermi pile moment.
I think you're right.
But I think it's because the hope is that they are getting closer to that Fermi pile moment, and then if you get there, the scalability of fusion on paper sounds easier because you don't have to deal with uranium and those issues. So I just say all this to say that we're focused on commercial viability. The executive order talks about aligning incentives to reinvigorate the commercial sector. It's interesting to see the different types of money and colors of money and investors and what they're interested in, fission versus fusion, including for space. And I think, at least within the government, we're going to do everything we can. The Secretary Wright was, I think, on at the Nuclear Energy Institute last week. I mean, we're going to try to give every nudge that we can, right, to really unlock this. But there's still a little bit of a way to go.
Well, it's still so exciting to hear. Thank you for that update.
I was
Amy?
just at on fusion, there's an element of like put it all on black, right? There with the private capital, they like to diversify their investments, and they are going to lose money on a lot of them, but they want to make sure that they at least get something that went big. Right, and fusion, I think they see the potential as being so big that they're like, we're going to put it all on black. Like, to hope this is like the one, like we bet behind the one company that breaks the code for figuring out commercial fusion, right? And so there's a bit of gambling going on, I think, with the private sector money. And there's also, you still come back to the, super rich guy who's like, this is going to be the thing that I'm going to continue to invest. So it's unique, but I mean, you're right. Like there's more and more companies that are investing now into nuclear that wouldn't have done it before, but they're also coming in because they see a path forward, right? That's on the time horizons that they want. And also, they don't have an alternative. They need it really bad. Yeah.
And I'm excited about fusion, but I just think that for fission, we can do this now.
Yes.
Hot rocks and water.
I have a ton more questions, but I want to open the floor. If you guys want to ask a question of the panelists, and by the way, this is one of the best panels I've ever chaired. I'm going to have to go watch
Dialogue
it
is fun, folks, so please ask us questions. It's much better if you guys jump in and nail us. So go ahead.
And just say what your name is. And oh, look, I know this person.
It's Joe Cassidy, Explore Mars, L3 Harris.
There's a spotlight coming.
So I have a question along the line you're just talking about, and somewhat alluding to Fred's problem. Attracting investors
Which one?
for space, for nuclear.
I'm not
Can
a
you speak
billionaire.
about indemnification and the insurance issue And how does that affect that investment calculus?
I feel like that goes to the lawyer. Am I?
Go for it.
Okay, all right. So there's two government regimes to think about here for indemnification and liability. One is Price-Anderson Act. So Price-Anderson Act is the law in place that kind of channels nuclear liability to a nuclear operator, and then also has in place an insurance regime that ensures that there's prompt kind of financial payment and there's a liability cap, and like it just creates the world where your insurance company is like, yikes, nuclear, no thank you. In fact, the insurance company that does the nuclear liability insurance makes money hand over fist because there's nothing that ever goes wrong at nuclear power plants. So knock on wood. Anyway, so there's also a DOE indemnification under Price-Anderson for a DOE contractor, which is why I said earlier, when you give me the DOE hypothetical, when you're launching something into space and DOE's involved, it's way easier. One, there's already a path forward. Two, there's statutory authority in the Atomic Energy Act. Three, you can invoke the DOE Price-Anderson Act indemnity provision so that you can make sure you can insure the project, or you don't have to worry about that aspect of it. So that is easier. The other is, for example, if this was a NASA-involved project, right, or a DoD-involved project, and a good example would be Project Pele. Under Project Pele, which is a microreactor that was intended to demonstrate that it could be deployed at a forward operating base, the original proposed contract model did not include the Department of Energy. Right, so the Department of Defense was left with, we don't include anything that has to do with insurance and indemnification, or we use Public Law 85-104. Yeah, so.
804.
804, thank you.
She told me about it.
I did, I was the one who told you about it, and I looked at you to be like, did I get that number right? So anyway, that public law it allows certain government agencies to invoke this indemnification for super hazardous activities that includes the use of radioactive materials. When the Project Pele participants were left with their choice between that public law or Price-Anderson, they're like, no thanks, we want Price-Anderson. And it's because it's more comprehensive and more clear and stronger, and it's required to be invoked. Anytime DOE engages in a contract that could give rise to Price-Anderson Act authority, they have to invoke it. Any like a hazard or harm from radioactive material, they have to use it. And the public law is at the discretion of the agency. And so DOD tried to get by with just that, and everybody pushed back, so they actually brought DOE as a contracting party so you could invoke the Price-Anderson Act provision. The interesting thing is if you have a purely commercial space project, this came up recently with the Price-Anderson Act renewal, and it was comments that NEI submitted, which was, we think Price-Anderson Act applies. Maybe at some point you guys could, they're going in with the presumption that it does, because it's better to assume it does and then make the argument that it does in the event that you ever needed it. You're like, of course it applies. However, that could be an area that could be clarified. So that's kind of the bins for nuclear liability and insurance.
Thank you. Other questions? Thanks, Amy, that was great.
Yes, my name is Mike Hilton. I'm a retired aerospace engineer. Regarding nuclear fission, I'm not familiar with the Price-Anderson Act that you were talking about, but what do you do with the radioactive nuclear wastes from this with the space travel and on Mars and on the ground?
Can I
Kurt.
jump on that one first?
You may.
So for purposes of a commercial application, what we would do is we would run our reactor as part of an orbit transfer vehicle. And after 30 or so trips, we'd probably take it out to Earth Moon Lagrange 4 and leave it there. That's where we would deposit it. That would be the nuclear waste depository.
Underground? Or?
No, L4. We'd put it on.
Oh, L4.
We'd leave it at L4. And we think L4 or L5, nice stable points to go play in. Good places to be. FAA, by the way, agrees with this. I've seen their remarks on this. We put it there and we can watch it. These are spots we know, and if somebody wants to sidle up and take a look at our HALU or whatever, we might have some warning that they're doing that. So I think it's a good place to go if you want to throw stuff away that's still in cislunar space. That's where we're coming from.
Kurt, what is NASA thinking?
Yeah, so that's a great answer. And just to clarify, right, none of this stuff is ever coming back to Earth. Once you put it in space and turn it on, you're never bringing it back to Earth. That is never our plan. It's never we would never operate it in such a way. We launch it cold, so it's never even been on before you launch it. So it is radioactive cold until it reaches orbit, and then only once it's at a nuclear safe orbit, that's an orbit that's high enough where it won't decay during the lifetime of the spacecraft. Then you turn it on.
questions about
Lagrange
waste.
points are
What
great
happened
points
at
to
the
put
end?
waste. You asked about actually on the planets too. That's a more tricky question, right? Because you're gonna drop it down there and it's gonna sit there. So that is still an ongoing discussion. In fact, I know that the Stigger at the National Academies recently had kind of a lively discussion about that specific point. What do you do about reactors that are going to drop on a planet like the Moon or Mars when they get to end of life? There is not a great answer for that yet. So obviously, they're going to be shut down, and they'll be allowed to sit there and cool down over time. But there's no plan and there's no current capability to go up and retrieve them or disassemble them or decommission them.
And that's
Leanne,
true
did
for
you wanna add
the
something?
nuclear waste, the radioactive nuclear waste as
it
well?
would just sit, yeah, it would just sit there in the reactor, and over time, right, that waste would decay into its it would continue to decay into various constituent parts. Those radionuclides would die out, but it would take a long time, because there are half-lives involved.
I heard of a company that can recycle radioactive waste so that at the end of the day, you still have some radioactive waste, but it's a lot smaller.
Yes.
I'm not sure
On the
that's-
ground, yes, it's a pretty advanced.
You have to defuel
apparatus.
your reactor. You got to process it and everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Rhian, were you going to add something to that? Okay, well, we are out of time. However, if you all would indulge me, I would like each of the panelists to say one last thing they want to say. If there was one thing you could do today, you could wave a magic wand, what would you do? Rhian, then Kurt, Amy, Fred.
I think just pick a direction and go in that direction and make something happen.
Move. I love it. Kurt.
So I think we need to start flying these things. We're close to flying nuclear thermal propulsion. We can get to nuclear electric propulsion quickly. We can get to doing power in space. You need to start flying these things. We need experience doing it.
Move out.
Yeah,
Amy.
so mine is the same, and it's the same for terrestrial applications. We need to build and deploy. We need to demonstrate.
Love it. Fred.
I mean, I can't disagree with that, and you're not going to rain $1 billion on me. So, what I would want if I could wish for it now is either obliterating or fully streamlining the regulatory regime to make this a non-issue. I don't see that happening, but that would be super helpful for a small company which can't navigate the way large companies can in these kinds of environments.
But it can't take 6, 7, 8 years.
No, it can't. It has to
That
be
can't be
quick.
the answer.
For your reason, time, money, they're the same, right? We got to get it over with. So.
Love it. Okay, so I want to close with the poll. You've heard the debate, you've heard the discussion. How many of you think we'll be flying a reactor by 2030? Lights on,
Now
please,
they
and
really
I want to
don't buy
count.
it.
1, 2, 3,
think
4,
more.
5, 6,
You guys feel
7,
better?
8, 9, 10. Way more than before. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And please thank the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhavya.
That was really fun.